of New York was actually experiencing a massive nervous breakdown.
There was palpable fear in the hearts of people in the streets of the city at night. One man terrorized 16 million people.
This was a mystery. Nobody had even a clue as to who was doing this.
I lost my ability to love, have compassion. I became an animal.
For 13 months, David Berkowitz prowled the streets, looking for young women to kill. He called himself the Son of Sam and stirred up the emotions of hardened New Yorkers with his haunting words and hateful deeds. On Christmas Eve, 1975, David Berkowitz attacked a 14-year-old girl with a knife. As he tried to stab the girl through her winter coat, she screamed and struggled in his arms. Berkowitz cut himself with the knife.
It was so traumatically horrible to him that he vowed that he could never do that again. But then his mind went to work and he tried to figure out a different way to do it.
At his next attempt, and all the ones to follow, Berkowitz would use a far more impersonal weapon.
I became virtually a killing machine, a machine of destruction.
In the summer of 1953, Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz adopted a 3-day-old boy and brought him home to their small apartment in the Bronx. Little David was a blessing because the couple couldn't have children of their own. One of David's earliest memories was his parents telling him that he was adopted and that his real mother had died giving birth to him.
Every time he and his parents would pass the Bronx County Courthouse where the surrogates court is located, they would point to it, tell him that that's where the judge awarded him to them because they loved him more than anybody in the world.
Nathan Berkowitz worked 6 long days a week running a hardware store. Pearl was a homemaker who loved to show off her little boy. While David's childhood seemed normal enough, including Little League and occasional trips to Yankee Stadium with his father, David sensed early on that there was something wrong, something he could not express.
My parents had such great hopes for me. They tried to raise me as best as I could, you know, and they fed me and clothed me and gave me love, but there was just something in me that would not respond to that love and pushed it away. I was so self-destructive.
When David fought with other boys in the neighborhood, they would taunt him saying, "You're not a real kid, you're adopted."
Maybe it's sort of like a Pinocchio sense, you know, he was trying to be this real, live, biological boy, and somehow knowing that he was adopted made him feel less than genuine from day one.
Worse than the shame he felt over being adopted was his guilt, knowing that his biological mother had died in childbirth.
He would lie awake at night, fearing that his father was going to come and murder him in his bed because he had killed his biological mother.
David's dark imagination was fueled by the many horror films he watched on television. He suffered from terrible nightmares, but was often too frightened even to speak about them.
He would actually get in his closet, cover up with clothes and blankets that may have been in there, and stay there for hours, his family not even knowing where he was, tormented by these nightmares.
Berkowitz hated school and would run home as fast as he could to be with his mother, whom he adored. She was only too happy to dote on her only child. David, in turn, secretly poisoned his mother's parakeet to eliminate what he regarded as a rival for her affections. She never suspected her little angel. Despite David's adoration for his mother, he could also be cruel to her.
We were talking about his aggression during childhood, and he described it this way: "I was very vicious, you know, and mean towards her," meaning his adoptive mother, "and used to throw things at her and hurl insults at her."
When David was 10, his mother took him to see a child psychologist, but it didn't help. David was a secretive child, and no one was allowed into his world.
When he was a preteen, 10, 11, 12 years old, he would tell about climbing out the window at night down the fire escape and roam the streets of New York City. He said, like an alley cat.
The dark city alleys were a stark contrast to the light that David's mother brought into their home. Following Jewish tradition, she lit the Sabbath candles every Friday night. At the age of 13 in 1966, David had his bar mitzvah and read from the Bible in Hebrew. But the burden of his Jewish heritage only exacerbated his deep-rooted feelings of shame. "I'm not a proud Jew," he later wrote. "Jews are supposed to be honest, law-abiding, and respectful of parents. I am none of these. I am a disgrace." One night, shortly after his bar mitzvah, in a fit of adolescent rage, David said something cruel to his mother that he would have to live with for the rest of his life.
She was on her way out to go to dinner, and he screamed at her, I hate you, I hope you die." And essentially that was the last time he saw her alive. Unbeknownst to anyone, she was in the advanced stages of breast cancer and collapsed at dinner that evening.
The only person he really felt close to in the whole world wasted away in the cancer ward and then died. David cried for days.
I was a lot closer to my mom than I was to my dad. My dad, he had to work all the time, 6 days a week. It wasn't his fault. And then I had trouble, lots of trouble all through my youth, emotional problems and things, mental problems. And when she died, of course, then I lost everything.
David's loneliness intensified. He was extremely shy and blushed easily, especially around girls. He would ride his bike for hours, often to his mother's grave. He lingered in the cemetery, fascinated by the tombstones of people who died young. He wondered if the girls had been pretty.
My dad used to cry and plead with me to come and talk with him. And he says, I don't even know you, you're my son, you're like a stranger. That's just the way I was. I don't know why, it was just these blocks that were up where I just didn't want to share nothing that was on my mind, nothing that was on my heart. I was a closed book, and that was that.
Because of his chronic truancy, David barely graduated from high school. In 1971, the 18-year-old Berkowitz enlisted in the Army. He was full of patriotic fervor and fantasized about dying a heroic death in Vietnam. Instead, he was shipped to Korea and qualified as a sharpshooter with an M16 rifle. He tried to find a girlfriend among the Korean prostitutes who hung around the base, but he found the effort degrading. David wrote to his father, apologizing for being a burden and amounting to nothing in society. He wrote that he was sorry he turned out the way he did, stupid, hateful, ugly, destructive. Berkowitz begged his father to pretend he never had a son, to forget that he even existed. In 1973, as Berkowitz turned 20, the Army transferred him to Fort Knox, Kentucky. Out of his longing for companionship, he became involved with a Baptist church. He attended classes, read dozens of books, and soon was baptized.
He was particularly impressed about how families were together on Sundays and when they prayed together. And he wanted this to be part of this group very, very much.
All the preaching about evil, sin, and eternal damnation, however, constantly reminded Berkowitz of the bleak future that awaited him in hell. His religious fervor quickly extinguished. Berkowitz was also discovering that the Army was no place for him. After a series of disciplinary problems, he was discharged in 1974 and returned to New York. Eager for a fresh start, he enrolled at Bronx Community College. His father, too, had made a fresh start. Nathan remarried and decided to move to Florida and retire. Berkowitz resented his new stepmother and her daughter for invading his home and taking away his father. The 21-year-old began to feel that there was a mysterious force around him that repelled people. He referred to himself as der Schmutz, Yiddish for dirty one. His world was rapidly shrinking. Berkowitz moved into his own apartment and got a job as a warehouse security guard on the docks of the west side of Manhattan. From the depths of his loneliness, he began to think about the birth mother he never knew, the one whose death weighed on his conscience. Berkowitz would soon unravel the mystery of who he really was. What he found would propel him onto the street in search of blood. David Berkowitz began a desperate quest at the age of 21 to find out exactly whose son he really was. But instead of saving him from his misery, his journey to discover his birth parents would launch Berkowitz on a year-long killing spree.
He had gone to one of these freedom of adoption movement meetings and told them the story of how his mother had died giving birth to him, and he had a father out there somewhere, and people laughing at him and said, you know, what are you laughing about? This is a tragedy. You know, my mother died. They said, man, that's what they tell all of us.
Berkowitz called his adoptive father, Nathan, and demanded the truth. Nathan broke the news that David's birth mother was in fact alive. He explained that the adoption experts had advised against revealing the truth. Berkowitz was stunned. In an instant, he was delivered from a lifetime of guilt. He had not caused his mother's death after all. Berkowitz's adoption papers said that his real name was Richard David Falco, and that his parents were Betty and Tony Falco. He searched for them for months, but he kept hitting dead ends. Frustrated and lonely, Berkowitz, who had tried during his army years to find comfort in religion, now joined a cult of Satan worshippers. Berkowitz enjoyed the late-night rituals in the woods, the chanting, the drugs, and the opportunity to meet girls. He connected easily to the dark forces that the group worshipped. He even made a blood pact to serve the devil.
I was chanting the names of Lucifer over and over, and I was calling out to him. I said, you know, son of the morning, and prince, my Lord, you know, come into me right now, take control of this vessel. And I felt like I was being emptied of my own personality, and that something else somehow was coming in.
The group gave Berkowitz a sense of belonging to a family, and he eagerly accepted their mission. His other mission, to track down his biological parents, was finally accomplished after a year of searching. When he first spoke on the phone with his birth mother, Betty Falco, David's expectations soared.
At last, he had found his normalness, his biology, the reason for his existence. And what he thought would be this glorious moment when he would find his real live mom and they would fall lovingly into each other's arms, turned into one of the moments, if not the moment, of his greatest disappointment.
Berkowitz had fantasized about meeting a beautiful woman. What he found was a totally ordinary person, what he described as a nervous and frightened little woman. Betty apologized profusely for abandoning her little Richie.
I remember him mimicking her and saying, "Oh, Richie, I'm sorry, in this sort of high, whiny voice, and putting his hands over his ears as he did that to try to shut out the sound that he recalled her making.
Berkowitz hid his disappointment and told Betty that he loved her and forgave her because he knew she must have had a good reason for giving him up. Betty revealed to David that Tony Falco wasn't his real father. Betty Falco had secrets too. Betty, a daughter of poor Jewish immigrants, had married Tony as a teenager. After they had a daughter named Rosalind, Tony left Betty for another woman. Betty had then begun a long affair with Joseph Kleinman, a well-to-do Jewish businessman who was married with 3 children. In 1953, David was born. Kleinman would not tolerate the embarrassment of an illegitimate child. Betty too felt guilty and ashamed and quickly made arrangements for an adoption.
He learns at the moment of his imagined rebirth that he had intruded upon the lives of these 2 people who were simply together having sex.
Berkowitz's relief over not having killed his birth mother quickly turned to anger. He later wrote, "Here I was, never wanting to be born in the first place, miserable, maladjusted, plagued with death fantasies, only to find out that I was unwanted, an accident after all." This moment of truth lit a fuse in Berkowitz, but he never let his feelings show. For a while, he even maintained a relationship with his half-sister and her 2 daughters, who called him Uncle Richie and would jump into his arms when he arrived for dinner.
His sister seemed to be going out of her way to try to make up for all the things which he hadn't had, and as much as he wanted to believe it, he knew that it was false, that he was still this sort of counterfeit human being. He was adopted.
Berkowitz's visits grew less and less frequent, then stopped altogether. He later wrote, "I was getting a very powerful urge to kill most of my natural family. I fought hard to keep these thoughts from becoming actions, so I just stayed away altogether." The 22-year-old Berkowitz mysteriously told his half-sister that he would never hurt her or her daughters. Instead, on Christmas Eve 1975, Berkowitz attacked a 14-year-old girl in the Bronx with a small knife. The rage David had managed to keep under control for so long was starting to crack through his quiet exterior. The attack was too close a physical encounter for the withdrawn Berkowitz. The girl fought back, screamed, and escaped. Berkowitz decided that next time he'd use a gun. That Christmas Eve, a serial killer was born. In the bicentennial spring of 1976, Berkowitz was still working as a night watchman, but he complained that he couldn't sleep during the day because of howling dogs belonging to his landlord. He quit his job and moved to an apartment on the Hudson River outside the city, only to find more incessantly barking dogs in his new neighborhood. From 1976 to 1977, Berkowitz drove a taxi, worked in the post office, and tried to live with his paranoid feelings. He would often drive to the beach and sleep in his car for a few hours of peace. At the beach, David took long walks trying to sort out his scrambled mind. One day, he made a decision. As he later explained in a letter, "I was determined that I must slay a woman for revenge purposes. For all the suffering, mental suffering, they caused me." The 23-year-old Berkowitz paid a brief visit to his adoptive father in Florida. Nathan witnessed his son staring in the mirror, pounding his head with his hands. He tried to get David psychiatric help, but the young man refused, saying no one could help him, that it was too late. When Berkowitz left Florida, his vengeful fantasies grew more concrete. He drove to Houston to visit an old Army buddy who innocently helped Berkowitz buy a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver to protect himself, Berkowitz said on the long trip back to New York. Out of the darkness of his rage, the weapon was his final solution. In his tormented mind, the barking of the dogs became unbearable. With his anger and sexual frustrations mounting, it was just a matter of time before Berkowitz would express himself with his gun. The demons inside David Berkowitz were driving him to hunt the dark streets of New York City in search of a woman to kill. Only that would free him from his torment. On July 29, 1976, Jody Valenti was dropping off her friend Donna Loria in the Bronx. Berkowitz drove by and saw the two girls laughing and talking. He parked his car 2 blocks away and walked back. Then he circled the car at a distance, like an animal stalking its prey. Jody turned her head and saw Berkowitz's piercing eyes. She said, "Who's that?" As Donna turned to look, Berkowitz pulled his gun out of a brown paper bag and fired. In the silence that followed, Berkowitz was frozen. Jody pounded the car horn. Berkowitz popped out of his trance and ran. Donna's father burst out of the apartment building, screaming for help as he gathered his daughter in his arms. But she was already dead. Jody survived a bullet wound in her thigh and was able to give police a description of the killer. As Berkowitz fled in his 1970 yellow Ford Galaxy, he sang happily to himself. "I felt some peace," he later said. "While I didn't have a physical sexual orgasm, I certainly had a mental one. After a shooting, it was like I was walking on air." He didn't know if he had killed anyone until he read the New York Post that afternoon. After that, Berkowitz was out every week, cruising neighborhoods that bordered highways. In the fall of '76, he wounded 2 more young women, as well as a man who he probably mistook for a woman in the darkness. Donna DeMasi was shot in the neck. Joanne Lamino was paralyzed from the waist down. And Carl De Niro would end up with a metal plate in his head. Berkowitz was nervous during these first few attacks because he realized he was crossing over the greatest moral divide. "I was cognizant of finally being able to pass that point in which a human plays God," he would later confess. "I was anxious, excited, and tense." Berkowitz also got excited over the thought of being a hero. He fantasized about rushing into a burning building and saving women and children.
Almost every night when he was driving around looking for someone to kill, he always had a full emergency pack in the back of his car, at the same time looking for someone to save.
On a frigid night in January 1977, Berkowitz, with his gun in his pocket, cheerfully helped some stranded teenagers push their car out of a snowbank. And yet, later that very same night, Berkowitz crossed paths with Wall Street secretary Christine Freund, who was in a parked car with her boyfriend. She was shot and killed. Her boyfriend was unharmed. Up to this point, police still had no clue that the murders were related. The detective assigned to Freund's case sent the bullets to the ballistics lab for analysis.
I walked into the ballistics unit in the police academy. I met with George Simmons, and my purpose of going there was to meet him specifically, not his boss, not another ballistics detective, with him, because I had a lot of faith in him. And as I walked in, he said to me, "Joe, we have a psycho here."
Simmons explained that he had seen the same bullets in 3 other shootings since July. He was convinced they all came from the same rare kind of pistol, but he couldn't prove it yet. The 5th attack took place on March 8th, 5 weeks after the murder of Christine Freund, and less than 100 yards away in Queens. Virginia Voskerichian, a college student, had come to the U.S. with her family from Bulgaria, and only a year before had been made an American citizen. It was 7:30 in the evening when she was walking home from classes.
This guy walks up to her, and she sees the gun in her face and puts her school books in front of her. And he fires through the school books and puts a bullet in her brain.
This time, police were able to match the bullets to the first murder. No one could deny that there was a serial killer on the loose. The police dubbed him the .44 caliber killer and braced for him to strike again. Panic seized the city. Women cut their hair short and dyed it blonde because they thought the killer was gunning for long-haired brunettes.
I thought about the .44 caliber killer every day since it happened.
I go to beauty school up the block, and most of the girls are wearing their hair up because they're afraid of the .44 caliber killer. They wear it up.
One thing that I really don't do anymore is sit in parked cars.
A month after Virginia was murdered, in April 1977, Berkowitz wrote his neighbor, Sam Carr, a very sober letter saying he would take legal action unless Carr took care of his howling dog. In this letter, Berkowitz revealed his longing for companionship, writing about a wife who didn't exist. He explained that he and his wife tried to take time off to be together. "Just the 2 of us," he wrote, "to sleep late, to make love, to read, etc. But the barking and the howling continued, and we had no peace." Berkowitz got no response from Sam Carr. The following week, he was on the hunt again. At 3 a.m. on April 17th, he was headed home when he saw 2 heads over the seat of a car.
This was probably the worst night of my career. I was in charge of the nighttime detail. And we always felt, in investigating homicides, people are creatures of habit. So we always cover the areas where they already hit.
Less than 4 blocks from where Donna Lauria was killed, Berkowitz waited as a patrol car passed by and disappeared. He walked toward the car, dropped a note at the scene, and then fired. Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau were both shot and killed instantly. The note Berkowitz had dropped at the crime scene was the first solid lead for the police. It said, "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a woman hater. I am not, but I am a monster. I am the son of Sam." "I love to hunt," he wrote, "prowling the streets looking for fair game, tasty meat. I don't want to kill anymore. No, sir, no more. But I must honor thy father. I want to make love to the world. I love people. I don't belong on earth." He ended with a warning. "Let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back." Berkowitz had raised the stakes, and police responded. A task force was formed to coordinate the search for the killer. It was the most extensive manhunt in the history of New York.
Somebody came up with the theory that the MO of this particular shooter was exactly the same as the scenario on Starsky and Hutch. We sat and watched every Starsky and Hutch episode. That's how minute we got about this thing.
A few days after Valentina and Alexander were murdered, Berkowitz wrote another letter to Sam Carr, saying that his life was destroyed and he had nothing to lose anymore. "I can see there shall be no peace in my life until I end yours." A week later, Berkowitz shot and wounded Sam Carr's dog. The New York papers appealed to him to turn himself in. Berkowitz responded with a dark, chilling poem to the Daily News. It read, "Hello from the gutters of New York City, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood. I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest, anxious to please Sam. I love my work. Now the void has been filled." On June 26, 1977, Berkowitz staked out a disco in Queens. Sal Lupo and Judy Placido were wounded but survived.
Because he was faceless, because he was coming out of the shadows, because he would strike from behind, everybody figured anywhere they were, this guy could be over the hedge or around the corner, waiting to get you. There was palpable fear in the hearts of people in the streets of the city at night. One man terrorized 16 million people.
As the first anniversary of the killing spree approached, the city still cowered in fear, wondering who the son of Sam really was and what he had in store for them next. By July 1977, as the first anniversary of Donna Lauria's murder approached, one paper boldly proclaimed, "Death Day." Another asked, "Tell us, Sam, what have you planned for us tonight?" The streets were eerily quiet on the night of July 29th, and it passed without incident. 2 days later, on July 31st, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante went out on a date in Brooklyn. Before Stacy left, she and her sister joked that the odds of crossing paths with the son of Sam were 1,000,000 to 1. That night, Berkowitz was hiding in the park as Stacy and Robert parked their car. He watched them as they played on the swings. Back in their car, they were kissing passionately. Berkowitz fired 4 bullets into the passenger side window. He stood there mesmerized and then ran. Robert Violante lost one eye and was partially blinded in the other. Stacy Moskowitz lived for 39 hours and then died.
The entire city felt they'd lost a child. And the atmosphere the next day of the city changed from this terror to an anger and sympathy. You know, we're going to get you, you son of a bitch. Whatever happens, we're going to get you.
By now, Son of Sam was so notorious that Stacy's murder made headlines all over the world.
What he was doing was manipulating, dominating, and controlling society. And now this insignificant nobody, someone who feels like he's one grain of sand on a beach with billions and billions of grains of sand, he is important, and he finally has arrived.
It was only then that the son of Sam gave police the clue that would lead to his arrest. The night he killed Stacy Moskowitz, Berkowitz watched the police write him a ticket for parking his Ford next to a fire hydrant. A week later, he dutifully paid the ticket by mail. The police traced the license plate cited on the ticket to the name David Berkowitz. They quickly discovered that he had been sending harassing letters to a number of people, and that a man named Sam Carr claimed Berkowitz had shot his dog. Out of a pile of hundreds of tips and complaints from the public, Berkowitz's name appeared 3 times. On August 10th, 1977, a large team of detectives staked out Berkowitz's apartment. The end was anticlimactic. Berkowitz walked out of the apartment building with a brown paper bag and got into his car. A detective approached the car and told him to freeze. Berkowitz turned around and said, "Well, you finally got me." The officer asked, "Who do I have?" Berkowitz said matter-of-factly, "The son of Sam."
On the seat next to him in a brown paper bag is the .44 caliber gun that did all the shootings. No resistance, no shootout, no nothing. You got me. You got the son of Sam.
The police brought him in for questioning, and the media descended on them.
He came almost in a spotlight. There was a surreal feeling about it. We're finally putting a face to horror and terror.
Berkowitz confessed to all of the son of Sam murders, revealing details that only the killer could know.
He enjoyed talking about it. He enjoyed being able to give us what we and he only knew.
Facing the public for the first time, Berkowitz could not keep from smiling. Berkowitz showed no obvious sign of his dark, vengeful interior. He was cooperative and polite. When detectives asked him why he had paid his parking ticket, he responded, "Because I am a law-abiding citizen." At a news conference, Nathan Berkowitz, now 68 years old, expressed his grief for the families of the victims.
Did you have any possible thought it might be David?
No, I did not.
Upon learning that it is allegedly he, what was your immediate reaction, and how did you get the news?
I cried. I think that's enough, gentlemen, with respect to any further.
Berkowitz said he had been ordered to kill by demons originating from his neighbor Sam Carr, who he claimed was the devil in human form. For 8 months, Berkowitz was held in a bare-tiled room in the prison ward of the Kings County Hospital. A hearing was scheduled to determine if he was mentally fit to proceed to trial. During the first few weeks of his incarceration, guards reported that the son of Sam ate like a horse and slept like a baby. He rarely got upset and seemed to be indifferent to his plight. In tape-recorded interviews with psychiatrists, the son of Sam tried to explain himself.
And I had nothing against these victims. Who were these people to me? They were just people. I didn't hate them. I wasn't angry against them. So why did you do it? Well, Sam did it through me. He used me. He made me go out there and do it. I did it for him, for blood.
Right outside Berkowitz's window at the Kings County Hospital, a death rally was staged. Many New Yorkers were filled with bitter hatred for Berkowitz, but none more so than the parents of the 6 murdered and 7 wounded young adults.
After I saw what had happened to my boy's left eye, I had wished that his eyes could be taken out of his head for Robert's sake.
And I hope he lives a long time with this in his heart. And I hope he never has a minute's peace. Never. Never.
Just once I want to get my hands around his throat. He took something from me. So wouldn't you feel the same way? You'd want to get revenge, wouldn't you? And if anybody tells me no, I tell them they're sick.
Mike Loria and millions of other New Yorkers, and I have to say myself too, said, you know, yeah, he's got problems, mental problems, but he deserves to die. He deserves to die for what he did.
Sitting in his cell, Berkowitz began to feel the same way. Suicidal feelings overwhelmed him. In a letter, he wrote that he was a cursed person beyond hope. The court ruled that Berkowitz was fit to stand trial. Ignoring his lawyer's advice, Berkowitz decided to plead guilty and be punished for his crimes. He asked to be put away forever so he would not kill again. Berkowitz wrote to his father, begging him to accept his decision to plead guilty. Once again, he told his father, "I failed you, but it's over now. Please, let me have a little peace." In May 1978, the son of Sam pleaded guilty to 6 murders. A few weeks later, on the day of his sentencing, David threw a tantrum and broke the restraints on his straitjacket. The officers subdued Berkowitz and brought him into the courtroom.
They bring him into court, and he's subdued, but he looks around, he spots Nasa Moskowitz, and he starts yelling at her, "Stacy was a whore! Stacy was a whore!"
Before they could drag him out, Berkowitz screamed, "That's right, I'd kill her again. I'd kill them all again."
Nasa Moskowitz was standing up screaming at him, "You son of a bitch, you killed my daughter, you're gonna get killed yourself." It was an astounding moment.
Berkowitz was dragged from the courtroom biting and kicking. The sentencing was postponed. On June 13th, a greatly subdued Berkowitz stood before the court. The judge said, "It is this court's fervent wish that the defendant be imprisoned until the day of his death." The judge added that Berkowitz was an animal, and he wished he could have given him the death penalty. He was sentenced to 6 25-year-to-life consecutive terms and began his incarceration at the notorious Attica prison in upstate New York. The following year, in February 1979, Berkowitz announced that he had made up the story about the demons. At a press conference from Attica, he said he never heard voices, he was not insane, and he wanted nothing except to be left alone and to spend the rest of his life in prison. Later that same year, Berkowitz was almost killed by another inmate. Fearing retribution, Berkowitz refused to name his attacker. Following the attempt on his life, Berkowitz seemed to become more introspective about his crimes. He wrote in a letter that he did hate women, especially women who dance, he wrote, "I hate their sensuality." Berkowitz told a fellow inmate that he attacked women kissing in cars in order to prevent other illegitimate children from being born to suffer the way he did. Berkowitz settled into Attica and seemed to find some peace. For the next 14 years, he kept his silence with the public. Then, in 1993, Berkowitz came forward and revealed a new twist to the Son of Sam story that would capture the public's imagination once again. In 1993, David Berkowitz, after maintaining his silence in prison for 14 years, made a sensational announcement. He claimed that the Son of Sam killings were really the result of a satanic plot, that he had only killed 3 people, but was an accomplice in the others. Berkowitz said the satanic cult he had joined in the early 70s had lured him into a conspiracy to bring chaos to New York City through a series of murders.
I didn't know, I honestly didn't know that people were going to die one day. And I'm so very sorry that happened. And the people that didn't deserve it were just lost their lives. And I know that...
Berkowitz now claims that he pleaded guilty to all the crimes to get out of the cult and to protect his family from their vengeance. Experts who have studied Berkowitz's criminal behavior find the story unbelievable.
David Berkowitz is a paranoid individual. He is not reliable. He is not the type of person that someone else would even want to team up with, nor is he the type of person that wants to share the glory with anyone else. He simply did it on his own.
Berkowitz has been living in prison almost as long as he lived on the outside. In 1987, he moved to his present home at the Sullivan Correctional Facility. a super maximum security prison for notorious felons.
Prison is a place of oppressive darkness. There's nothing here. Just lonely, broken men whose dreams have died. That's all that's here. It's like a hell.
I started reading my Bible and Jesus set me free.
A Baptist minister named Don Dickerman took it upon himself to teach Berkowitz about forgiveness.
Actually, I wrote David a letter in 1978 and basically said, David, God still loves you and Jesus can save you.
Amen. Amen.
Dickerman later formed a friendship with Berkowitz.
Love you. I love you too. Love you too.
In 1987, Berkowitz claims to have had a religious awakening and now calls himself the Son of Hope. His born-again testimony has been distributed around the world.
This heaviness, these heavy chains, these invisible shackles, these mental chains that I was wrapped around, see, for years and years, just kind of snapped.
Berkowitz works as a chaplain's clerk in the prison and is the only inmate allowed to work in a special cell block with fellow prisoners who have emotional problems and learning disabilities.
They need some help. They need someone to talk to, someone to help them make their bed and get them dressed and so forth, someone to be a friend and listen to them when they have their problems. And that's my job. I work with the guys as I have like a ministry of caring to them.
Some people doubt the sincerity of Berkowitz's religious awakening, saying that he is putting on an act for the parole board and the rest of the world.
David Berkowitz is sitting in jail today, hoping and praying that he can get out. And I know if you would release him, God forbid if we ever did, and we never should, but if you would release him tomorrow, he would drop that religion.
Berkowitz, however, knows he will never be released. He says that the idea that God recognizes him and listens to him is the only reason he has to keep living.
David understands that people are skeptical, but I don't think he expects that people will ever forgive him. Maybe some. He knows the state will never forgive him, but he knows God has forgiven him, and he's forgiven himself.
I would like to think that God has allowed me the opportunity to make my life count now, to give me some meaning and purpose, which I have been searching for so long. I like to think that somehow that the past could gradually be wiped away.
In prison, ironically, Berkowitz appears to have found the surrogate family he was searching for throughout his early life. Through his crimes, he acted out a dark fantasy and terrorized the city. Now he wants to be known as the Son of Hope, but he will always be a prisoner of his own creation, the Son of Sam.
Certain media coverage of the killings drew criticism at the time, especially from some competing papers that felt the murders were being exploited and Berkowitz was being glorified. Eye on 2 was a talk show here on CBS 2. There was a panel of guests, including Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin, who sat down together in October of that year. And you can see that part of our special, as well as anything you missed here on CBSNewYork.com. I'm Maurice Dubois. This has been a look back at the Son of Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Son of Sam was a big story for everybody, but it was even bigger for Jimmy Breslin. That's because the killer chose Breslin as his conduit to a larger public. Soon, both of them had made it to a chosen spot, the front page. Alexander Coburn of the Village Voice is one media critic who has questioned Jimmy Breslin's Son of Sam coverage, especially Breslin's use of a letter apparently sent him by David Berkowitz.
You said in one of your columns, you said when discussing this matter, whether you should have published the letter, you talked about the danger of self-censorship, and I think the history of this sees it's not a matter of self-censorship, it's a matter of seeing what you're actually doing in journalism in creating what I thought was one of the most disgusting episodes I've seen in journalism, which is pandering to this whole the series of murders over the summer and into the fall.
Do you, I mean, you're suggesting that murder isn't a big story? Is that your opinion?
I think murder, as the story became in the papers, it was blown ludicrously out of proportion and with very unhealthy social results.
What were the unhealthy social results?
I think the present mayor-elect, Mr. Koch, advocating capital punishment in certain
Ed
cases.
Koch has been advocating capital punishment for some time, and he didn't.
Yeah, but why do you think it took off on that particular occasion?
Well, Abe Beam, you yourself noted that Abe Beam did try to ride this story a little bit.
Abe Beam started it by coming in, started the political aspect of it by coming in. But at this time, you know, you've got to remember here, this man had killed 5 people before anyone took any notice of the fact that the murders were connected, before, in fact, ballistics was able to put the thing together. That's one. Two, there have been, if there's one thing I learned out of this, it's that we covered this as I would cover it again. I mean, I don't care if it's a murder, that's goes through the ages. That's, Shakespeare wrote about them. How many times have there been lunatics loose in the black community and they've killed just as Berkowitz did, 6 and 7, and we took no note of it at all? I mean, that's the thing I learned out of this, to start watching up there. They, in neighborhoods where the poor people live, this was common.
I agree, and I think that's a very valid point. But to stick to this case in point, what about the predictive aspects of, let's say, the column on Death Day, on the anniversary of the shooting of the first victim? After Bobby Violante and Stacy Moskowitz were killed 36 hours after Death Day, did you ever have a moment saying, geez, did I cause this? Did this column trigger this? Not. No. Never occurred to you as a possibility.
And in reading the psychiatric report on Berkowitz, it just would when it's released finally, it'll just reinforce that too. I mean, he just was going out 30 nights a month looking for someone to kill. And he would look at a face that's every night of the week.
And yet the news media and the mayor combined to make that night, the night of the 29th of July, into a kind of special night. And this, as you say, from a killer who previously hadn't shown any chronological pattern. Is that like taunting the guy into action?
No, I don't think it was taunting. I mean, this man had just been going out looking to kill at all times. And where did it begin? It started with him writing about it, the 29th. He was the one that brought up the date. He was the one that impressed the police, and that most of the psychiatrists seemed to think that that was a date that was an important date.
You mentioned the police, and Alec, you had mentioned the police in the column, that this is the kind of story in which reporters have to work with the police in ways that I know you found very troubling, Alex. You mentioned that...
One thing on the 29th...
I think on this police thing, I think it came to the fact that Breslin and other people, there was a symbiosis with the police. I think very often, I think, in explaining why that original letter was published in the news, which I have a lot of problems with, it's the police...
You have problems with publishing that letter? Then obviously you're not in the news business.
Well, it's like saying, you know, maybe I'm not a prostitute. What do you want me to say?
No, I mean, you've already said you're not in the news business. That we've just determined.
No problems. If you have no problems
with publishing that letter, no, I'm in the news business.
You just
quite
said
obviously you're not.
No, you said you have no problems thinking back that might have stimulated the guy to do it. If you've never even thought of that,
oh well, then you really don't know.
You really that your columns there, you never even considered that might have prompted him to do a killing that particular time.
You're not in the news business. That was a...
We're saying the end of the news business, the result of the news business is the headlines around the studio.
No,
it's the headlines
business. My business is
psychotic reaction to this.
Well, then what should we do? Not write?
I think you read a good deal too much about it. Yeah, I certainly do. And I think the Post became a newspaper war and people made money out of it.
It seems to me you still write about it in order to keep the name alive. You're still writing about it weeks after everyone has. What is your preoccupation?
Because you know
that people read it the minute they read the name. Come on, stop playing games with me.
No, there's no games playing. Look at these headlines around. Do you think that there was no exaggeration of this case at all?
Work a little bit in the business, then come back and talk. You want to know about publishing that letter? You think that is there some question that letter shouldn't have been published? Is that the problem here? A letter from Berkowitz to Breslin shouldn't have been published.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm ready to say that. I am ready to ask, though, once the police start saying, publish this and don't publish that.
Here's exactly...
Don't tell them about the...
I'll tell you exactly.
The fingerprint, for example.
The fingerprint we held out. Right. No question about it. That there was a fingerprint on the letter we held out. No question. Here's exactly how that letter came to the office on a day I wasn't there, and it was read by Anne-Marie Caggiano, works in there, and Pete Hamill. And they called me up and said, this is a lunatic wrote this time. You better come in and look at it. So I said, send it to the police to let them look at it. I'm home. I was working. And the police called back and said, could we meet you at the 109th Precinct? This is a letter from the fellow. And they gave me the letter and said, no, we've got to hold, they gave me a copy. They had the original letter had to be held as evidence, right? Fine. They said, now, what do you think you could do with it to help us? That wasn't there. They were not running. And so I said, well, let's talk. We spoke for an hour and a half. And we weren't getting, nobody had anything particular ideas. And I said, I know one psychiatrist that I always speak to in this city.
Did you do anything else on police request other than not mention the fingerprint?
Never. Not a thing. Yes, I kept addresses out of 2 people. Just
do you
put their
worry
names
about
in.
this as a continuing relationship? In other words, does this give the police department a hold on Breslin? We helped you on this, you helped us on that, whatever.
Me, it was, you know, that we were talking was very great. I mean, my position on the police had been, they just don't put enough men on the street, and they don't work long enough hours. I've been writing that for all my life. 25-hour week is long for a policeman.
Jimmy, frankly, as writing this story, this became a kind of newspaper war. Was there ever a time when you heard the Post footsteps, when you got a sense of we've got to have a bigger story, bigger black print?
Come on, that's absurd.
Is it
Absolutely
absurd?
not. Yes. For me, it is.
It isn't for me. I'm very curious
well,
what
I
channels 4, 7, 9, 11,
Well, I'm
68
not.
are doing.
I really am not.
You say you're in the news business. Presumably
I
you
am
think
not.
what the opposition is doing.
I just think what Jimmy Breslin does, and that's it. And I really don't. I can't be responsible for anyone else.
So that
what
second
they
time
do,
the
I just
letter
have
went
to
on the
do it
front page,
myself.
the letter after the
That they
Berkowitz was
ran.
arrested?
That
And
they
and
wrote me a letter
came
and
on the front
ran.
page? What
Well,
good did that do?
I don't know. A letter came. I thought it was of interest to readers, and it ran. There seems to be some interest out in the streets to do with this case, and we
Is that a
served that
healthy
interest.
interest, do you think?
Is that a healthy interest? Murder?
Yeah. Or in this particular kind of...
Gee, Shakespeare had no trouble finding it healthy, did he? Murder, huh? Through all the ages. The New Yorkers seemed to have some trouble with it, and yet they were the first ones to run In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I mean, they devoted an issue to it. They never had any problem with murder either. It just, in the anxiousness to get into the topic, which was a consuming topic, people like the New Yorker, Mr. Coburn, would write critical articles about the people involved in it, thereby putting themselves into it and giving themselves a chance to write about it.
I'm saying that the news coverage
Gentlemen, we have done the television's favorite trick. We've run out of time. While Jimmy Breslin was wrestling with being Son of Sam's conduit and his conscience, a rival cross town was mad to become his chronicler. The New York Post got Son of Sam into the paper just about any way it could. As Simon Galvin, who worked with New York Post publisher Rupert Murdoch in Australia, put it, it was really quite a break. This is the kind of story that Rupert does best. He's always been lucky that way. The point man of the Murdoch platoon, reporter Steve Dunleavy, and we'll talk with him next. Son of Sam may have been Rupert Murdoch's meat, but the Post was still second at the table to Breslin and the Daily News. And a lot of critics have said that Post reporter Steve Dunleavy went to inexcusable lengths to catch up. One example, an ill-founded scare story like the one of July 29th, the anniversary of the first killing of Donna Lauria. Gunman sparks Son of Sam chase, reads the headline, but of course by the time the headline ran, Steve, you, the Post, and the police all knew that nobody was chasing Son of Sam that night. What's going on? Isn't that really just appealing to fear that's loose in the neighborhood?
Well, I think what's going on is you should do your homework. In actual fact, the police did say it was a Son of Sam chase. They employed the 109, and at one stage they even thought...
How long did that story
hold? Up until 10 o'clock that morning, as a matter of fact. So I think before you say things like that, I think you should check. First of all, you said about we were second to the Daily News. Well, I think the very fact that Berkowitz wrote first to Jimmy, I mean, Jimmy's an actor, isn't he? You know, he really, you know, I'm a street reporter, and Berkowitz, being the nut that he was, wrote to the biggest profile. And Jimmy's an actor, you see, so they wrote to the actor. They didn't write to the editor of the New York Post or to the publisher or to
And
Steve
yet soon,
Dunleavy.
within days, wasn't the Post, wasn't Steve Dunleavy soliciting letters from David Berkowitz? Wasn't there a please open communications with us?
See, once again, you're not doing your homework. If you read the piece, and I'm sure it's here somewhere, you'd have said, please give yourself up. Give yourself up to the police. If not, call us. Now, another point of this is that the police...
Actually, I believe the sentence is call us, and if not, call the New York police.
Well,
that was, I think, the Post perspective on this almost throughout.
Well, no, not at all. That's absolute rubbish. The point is that the police, how many thousand strong they are, there's more police than there are reporters. But as the police quite obviously saw, we had a much better conduit. And we're talking about a city that was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It certainly was. I mean, to say, when you get people cutting their hair, when you get people dyeing their hair, when you get my wife who was scared to even walk the street, when you get me who was scared to walk the street, for God's sake, you know, we knew what was going down.
Arya Nair is with us, and Arya is with the American Civil Liberties Union. Truthfully, what Steve is talking about sounds to me like self-induced hysteria. I'm wondering whether there wasn't a kind of socially induced hysteria.
Well, I guess what bothers me most is that Mr. Dunleavy just now cited the police in order to justify his stories. I was bothered all along that the papers not only induced the hysteria, not only made Son of Sam a great celebrity, and I object to that, but that they also crawled into bed with the police. They suspended all critical judgment of the police. He tells us now that he ran that story about the gunman, and the police were still telling him that that was the gunman, or that was Son of Sam they thought they were chasing. I don't know if he ever did a story criticizing them afterwards for misleading him, misleading the city of New York. I don't recall any stories in the Post or almost any other paper criticizing the police.
Look, I don't know what the civil liberties are doing in on this conversation in the first place.
Well, I don't like the press and the police in bed together. That's one thing.
The police and the press in bed together. For God's sake, we were trying to catch a killer. Do you think that
Well, is that the press's job?
No, I'm sorry, you said?
I said, is that the press's job, to try and beat the case to a killer?
We went in bed with the police. Very rarely do I agree with Breslin, but I think what he said was right. I mean, they said, and they told him, you know, don't let's print this letter right now. And when they did tell him, I thought that they certainly felt that they were going to bring him out. As a matter of fact, I even remember someone from the Chicago Tribune, I remember the cop said, look, maybe a woman would bring him out, a woman's story would bring him out. We weren't worried about laying in bed with the police. What, do you think we were taking, do you think we were taking bribes or something from him? Or that we were giving them bribes? I don't think so. That's a fallacious argument. I don't know what you're doing here.
All you're saying is that you were a lousy policeman, that you were trying to play policeman.
Space and glory, and weren't you, in fact, in some sense, trading space and glory on this story with the police?
No reporter does that unless, I mean, you're a reporter. Do you indulge in glory? I'll throw the question back at you.
I think that some glory is inescapable, but it seems to me that in this story, glory or space became the quarry.
Well, I don't know. If you can't escape glory, I certainly can, you know. As I said, I'm just an average street reporter who does it untold. When the city editor appoints me, I go. That's about all there is to it.
One of the consequences of the way the press worked with the police is after they caught somebody, the police told the press all kinds of things the police had no business telling the press. They told the press that they got all kinds of information from Berkowitz, which only the killer could have known. The police violated every guideline of their own. They violated every court rule.
Is this something a newsman should worry about?
Let me take you up on that. Now, you tell me exactly what was said and what cop said it.
Okay, I can recall reading in the papers. I can recall reading in the papers detailed interviews between the police and David Berkowitz.
You've got a virulent imagination, I can tell you, because as a matter of fact, the cops.
Ask anybody in the city of New York, they'll remember that one.
Looking over my shoulder in the New York Post Carl Pellick's story, one of the lead paragraphs, Detective William Sullivan, one of those who questioned Berkowitz, said, quote, he shows no remorse.
Well, what indeed does that mean? I mean, apart from the fact that what else would a reporter do? Where does that say they lie in bed with the police? You know, that's a crock of garbage. I mean, they say, you know, you're looking under rocks, really.
The press served the role of the police to try and lure this person
I tell you what,
so as to be able to catch him.
I tell you what, if the press served the role of the police, if the press served the role of whatever the police wanted, I'll say this, I am very proud, extremely proud, of anything I did in concert with the police.
And that means that you suspended any critical judgment of the police.
Oh, absolutely rubbish. Who's suspending absolutely any critical judgment? How indeed? The American Civil Liberties Union criticizing the police for what they did? No, it's up to you, bunch of bums. The guy be still running around with a gun in his hand.
We'll take a look at the performance of television news when ION returns in a moment. The side of television is being criticized for exploiting violence. What are we on the news side doing when we allow Son of Sam to become so predominantly our own biggest story? One night recently in CBS Studio 46, a group of journalists talked about the television side of the coverage. Our guests were Chris Borgen and Ellen Fleischer, Channel 2 News, Carl Tucker, president of the Saturday Review, and Geraldo Rivera of ABC News.
You know, what worried me about the television, that night, that afternoon and that night, was that I got a feeling that instead of being apart from the mob, they were inside the mob and raising their voices and really almost inciting or adding to the flames, which made New York and New Yorkers a very upset and panicky place.
I certainly don't feel any personal responsibility for inciting anybody to anything.
Well, Geraldo, you've caught a lot of heat from some of your own colleagues as well for using words like fiend and murderer about David Berkowitz. Now, in retrospect, do those words still seem to you to be accurate and proper?
Yes, they do. I have exactly the quote. I was in Panama for 3 weeks after the controversy broke out, so I was the last person in New York to know that I was catching heat. As a matter of fact, I never got any heat from anybody except for the New York Post, which I thought was a real joke. Here's my, I'll read just for it to take me 15 seconds. Quote, my last commentary on the day he was caught. And so on the streets of the city today, there's anger and there's outrage at the murder suspect. There are bittersweet memories of his victims, but mostly there's a sense of relief. The man police say is the .44 caliber killer, the fiend who thought so much of his own hang-ups and so little of the value of human life, has finally been captured. Now, I don't think that that's incendiary at all. And
the word fiend.
Yeah, I say the man police say is the .44 caliber killer, the fiend who... I think that the .44 caliber killer, I say the man the police say is the .44 caliber, the .44 caliber killer, whether he's David Berkowitz, Mr. X, or Mr. Y, is a fiend. The man who did those things was a fiend. Now, the definition of fiend, I'm sure, is definitely broad enough to encompass someone who murders 7, wounds 6, and has a city in a reign of terror for a year.
Grammatically, your case is very good. It doesn't know whether you're describing David Berkowitz or the .44 caliber killer.
Chris, one of the things that you were criticized for in a WCBS radio editorial was a piece in which apparently you demonstrated the .44 caliber killer's stance. This was at a time when that was an issue. That was supposed to be one of the clues, that he assumed the Kojak two-handed firing stance. The people at WCBS seem to feel that this was a dangerous and irresponsible thing to do, and I guess in the sense that television can beget repetition and can beget imitation, it is sort of scary. As you think back on that, is WCBS off base? Is this an easy shot? Or is this something
I think you're asking me, in effect, if I had to do it today, would I do the same thing? And I think the answer to that is yes. And for a very simple reason. I was doing a story in which I was trying to walk back through with a fantastic leader which says this is a reenactment, as to what actually transpired in the 3.5 minutes of the moment of the two people coming off of the bridge, going back to their car, and he, the son of Sam, allegedly came out of the bushes. I was trying to illustrate what was seen, or could have been seen, by people in the area had they been looking. There had been a continuing request on the part of the police department for all information to be forthcoming. And I did walk across the street and with my hands, raised my hands in the manner. I didn't have a gun or make believe that I had a gun. And I pointed at the car and said, he then fired 4 shots. If I was to be criticized, I think the criticism should have been that, in fact, 3 shots were fired.
Carl, what sort of thoughts do you have coming from a print perspective as you've watched us electronic types really kick this ball around?
Well, I think the answer is the same one that you've arrived at, that it depends very heavily on the personality, the honesty and decency of the individual reporter. I think that if there is a lesson to be learned, it is that the news networks, the news media, should make it their business to inculcate that kind of self-consciousness in a reporter so that he is able to step back and say, am I part of the mob, or am I putting this thing in perspective?
So that what you're saying then is that what Geraldo says is emotional honesty and sincerity and important to the truth of the story. You are saying that the reporter really has a responsibility to edit all of that.
No, he has the responsibility to do both. I know Geraldo's a good case, because you have a very personal style of newscasting, but all that I ask, and I believe you when you get emotionally concerned about a story because of your style, I don't know why, but I believe you, that there's reason to be that involved in it. The point is that you have to keep balanced in your mind. Am I being a grandstander? Am I trying to grab more time than this story really deserves? Or am I giving this story its fair shake? And that has to go inside the mind of the individual news person.
History is hindsight. Journalism is writing to deadline. Speaking the truth as best we know it at the time. Sometimes we're wrong. In the heat of a chase the size of Son of Sam, sometimes we write and talk as if we knew the final score. We don't. And when we forget that we don't, we can only rely on our viewers and our readers to remember for us and to forgive us our occasional errors. For Channel 2 News, this has been Eye on Son of Sam and the Media. I'm Dave Marish. Good night, and thanks for being with us.